Hello everyone, and welcome to a new video on Fire Emblem Vision Quest. I am Pandan, and today I wanted to reflect a bit on the project and talk a bit about design. So this is a video that you can certainly turn away from and put on the background, flip to another tab because I'm not moving from this screen, just to give you some context as far as what to expect. But I do want to talk about a couple of things that I've reflected on, mostly things that I regret and that I would do differently, having built the hack and now reflecting on the completed project for now what it feels like over half a year. And so I've gotten a lot of feedback. Most of it's been really positive, which is encouraging. I do see pretty consistent negative feedback in certain areas, and there are certain things that I did, back in 2018 when I started that I ultimately ended up regretting and learned from. And so I wanted to share that here in this video so that, if you're looking to make certain decisions about design, maybe my reflections can be helpful in some way. So that's the purpose here. So I'm going to talk about a couple of different topics throughout the course of this video and just share my thoughts on some aspects to Vision Quest's design and how I feel about it now. And so some of these things will be a little bit more tactical. Like, one of the first issues that I have with Vision Quest, and this is something that's been a problem for me as I've gone to scale, is the way I designed hard mode. So originally, I balanced the game around normal mode, making normal mode the intended experience. While it would be necessarily not as easy as a regular normal mode, the idea would be that it would be normal and then there'd be a difficulty higher. The challenge with this is that it's a lot harder to successfully scale stats up than it is to scale stats down. So I've learned that in order to make a more balanced experience across the board, both up and down, it's easier to balance for your hardest difficulty first and then scale down accordingly. Because if you know that the game is beatable on the hardest difficulty, it should, in theory, be defeatable on the earliest difficulties. Similarly, I kind of regret doing hard mode bonuses. They're really fun, and I like the sort of FE6 jank that it invites, but ultimately, I think that if I was to make a new hack, I probably wouldn't do that and just focus on making a really challenging, well-balanced experience, kind of like what I did in normal mode, but a little bit more difficult. And one of the challenges here that made what I did so difficult is the way I did stats. So for you novice ROM hackers out there, when you're organizing stats for enemies in Fire Emblem GBA, they come from two places. They come from the class ID and the unit ID. And the class ID is equivalent to the class bases. So it will say Myrmidons get a base of 8 speed, for example, while Knights get a base of 0. And the game will take these when you're making generics and spit them out, and those are your enemies with whatever auto level adjustments or whatever growths you set per class. Unit IDs correspond to specific units. So, for example, Storch has his own unit ID. Similarly, I made separate unit IDs for generics like Bolaro or Empire or Navan. Whoever the enemy was that just has that same generic title, I made different unit IDs for. Now, I did this in a very non-scalable way where I would have class IDs, and then I would use a unit ID, and then I would tweak the stats at the unit ID level for enemies to tailor difficulty. And the problem with that is that it makes scaling kind of awkward. It makes leveling up and down a bit more challenging. What I should have done, and what I've been doing for some other things I've been working on, is setting the unit ID bases to 0, and then just letting the class bases be the bases, and then do auto levels to estimate how strong I want the enemies at each level. And what's nice about this is that I can use fewer unit IDs per different classes. I don't have to make specific adjustments based on class that I want to tailor, because I can do that through the growth rates. So it's a bit more scalable. It's a bit more, for lack of a better word, programmatic in how things level up. And so using the auto levels that you can adjust in the chapter data editor table is what I should have done from the start versus setting that kind of at 0 and then manually adjusting. It made things a little bit more challenging. And now as I revisit hard mode, it would create quite a lot of extra work to strip all that out and redo. So I'm debating that still if I want to do that as part of an update. But definitely one of the biggest regrets I have. So I would strongly encourage you to use your class IDs and auto levels as much as possible, and then let your unit IDs for generics just be flat. Just let them be 0. Don't make any special adjustments at the unit ID level. For player units, certainly, because you want to add personal bases, right? You may want to give some of your characters additional bases on top of the class bases, and that's fine, and that works. You may want to adjust what the base rank is. You may want to give them a special skill. Like, adjusting stuff for the unit table for players makes a lot of sense. For enemies, I wouldn't do it. Again, so something to keep in mind, and that's probably one of the biggest mistakes and regrets I have with this, so I hope that that's a helpful tip. Kind of speaking of units and unit balance, one thing that I went back and forth on a lot throughout development and that I ultimately think I regret and don't enjoy as much is the way I did skills. So in Vision Quest, the way skills work is that each unit has a personal skill and a class skill that they get at level 15, with the exception of rogues who get their skill Lock Touch on promotion and Steel Plus at level 5, as well as the monotype infantry units like Berserkers, Swordmasters, Halberdiers, and Snipers. They all get a crit bonus at level 5 promoted, versus standard getting it the moment you promote. I ultimately decided that I think skills don't really add that much of anything meaningful to gameplay. And for someone like me who's not inclined to develop my own skills to exactly meet my needs, slapping in the presets can be fine for certain things, but ultimately I find that it was limited given how big the roster was, how large the class list was. You know, there's people joke that like every unit in Vision Quest has Wrath and Nihil, and they're solid skills, but not necessarily as personal. So if I was to do it again, I probably would ditch the level 15 skill for classes and maybe only do personal skills, plus whatever like class specific skills that like people expect, like the crit bonus or Lock Touch and things like that. But like I would get rid of like the custom class skills I did. In general, I think that would be something I would remove. Personal skills, I think they add quite a bit of flavor and can be good. I think some of them I did were better than others, but ultimately I probably wouldn't do it again. But I think if I was to use skills, it would likely be on a personal basis. So just thinking about skills and how I've used them, I'd probably pare it down a little bit further. And that's something I did throughout development. I used to have 2 skills on every unit plus their personal, so it'd be 3 skills at minimum. It just got a lot, or to be a lot, and so I found that paring it down made more sense. Another thing that I plan to address in a future update is the level curve in Part 2. I've gotten a lot of feedback that Part 2 in Vision Quest is pretty easy compared to some of the other parts. Some people say like the maps aren't as great. I think it's probably one of the most divisive parts, and the data I have from the survey confirms that, where a lot of people really like it or they really don't like it. And part of it is because I think the maps are a bit more innovative in their design. I was certainly more experimental in Part 2, but also the enemy quality takes a huge dip and really flatlines. And this part's also had a lot of edits happen throughout its lifespan, mostly to extend it and shift around some of the maps. And while I'm pretty content with the maps themselves, I do agree that the game could be more difficult. My mistake was that I kept the level curve flat because I assumed the player would want to rotate units or that the player would die more. So for people who play the game with just using a single set of units, and also people who don't reset on death, they quickly outleveled all of the enemies, and especially with promo bonuses, really made mincemeat of them. So one of the things I'm going to be doing in a future update, and this is thankfully something that's easier to change, is to beef up the levels of some of the Part 2 enemies, kind of help that scale a bit more, make the inventories a bit tougher, harder to deal with, and move around promotion items so it delays when the player gets better stats. So I'm hoping this will make a more even experience and a more challenging difficulty without doing too much else, but I'll need to test and see. But my advice to you, viewer, is to assume that the player is going to try and romp with a set batch of units and that they probably won't rotate very much unless your game forces it, which from experience I don't think is very popular. So definitely focus on keeping enemy quality high, assume the player is going to continue to scale, especially if, you know, your growth rates scale a certain way. So my last gameplay piece that I'll talk about kind of also similarly focuses on scale, and that's on tiered effectives. One thing that I really like from Souls of the Forest, and in my effort to make Vision Quest the Souls of the Forest inspired hackrom, I regret not doing tiered effectives, and what that means is that instead of just having your hammers, your zambatos, your heavy spears, and that being the only ×3 effective weapon, doing tiers of them, so there's like a iron, steel, and silver tier for each of those that scales with the game, because towards the end they become not very strong, and they have a lot more drawbacks. Early in the game they're really powerful, but they become less useful later on. I think in Vision Quest it's okay because the enemies have generally pretty decent HP and don't get one hit by them too often, but as the game progresses they become a little less useful, and I want them to continue being scary on enemies in particular. So scaling them up and making higher tiered ones was something that I would be interested in exploring and that I would encourage you to explore. Souls of the Forest does that really well, and that's something I think I should have tried to make the scarier enemies also a thing. Now, kind of getting into some of the other areas of the hack that I've been thinking about. One mistake I think I made was the lack of writing in Part 3. I get this feedback a lot that Part 3 doesn't really have much of a story. There's a couple reasons for that. One was I didn't feel like writing when I put this together. I really wanted to do gameplay design and map design, and I think Part 3 is probably the most fun part of the hack for me. I really enjoy playing it every time. Story-wise, it's really quick, it's snappy. Part of that is just a function of my mood when I was doing it, but also that it's a lot of very quick successive battles, and there's not a lot of time for story in between each chapter, because it's kind of like Manster, where you're going from one map to the next map to the next map, and it's all part of like one consecutive escape for the most part, so there's not a lot of room for dialogue. But I do think in retrospect I should have written more. I could have fleshed out certain characters more. I do think Waluyo is a bit bland, and I'm not really sure what to do with him specifically. And I think I should have thought out his character and place in the story a bit more. But one of the main reasons Part 3 even exists is because I wanted to try something different, and I was getting really frustrated by Part 2 when I was building it. The first patch with Part 2 in it, which was like version 06, I thought it was really crappy. I pushed it out, I rushed it, I wasn't happy with it. I needed to do something different, and then after I did Part 3, I think a lot of momentum kind of swung back, and the game ultimately became better for it, although it does kind of harm the Iron Man ethos of the game, and also some people don't like party switches as much. So something I learned structurally. I probably wouldn't do something like that again, but I think I needed to do it, and I think the game is ultimately better for it, but there are certainly drawbacks as well, depending on how you like to play. But I think writing more would have probably warmed up more players to this part, especially considering how much dialogue and how much writing exists in the other parts of the story. Similarly, on the writing front, I do think I should have spent more time writing music. I did a couple of tracks here and there, but I didn't spend as much time on it as maybe I should have. I think I could have done a lot more cool custom music had I set aside time to, and I just didn't. And that's something I think I would like to explore more next time, is sitting down and making more of my own music and teaching myself to make better video game compositions. So something for me to consider there. Let's see. Similarly on the writing front, one thing that I wish I did when I was doing like the early world building was accounting for racial and ethnic diversity more in the project. The game is pretty much just like, you know, white people and then some Asian people, as you can see in like Mahala and then like Kuching to an extent. You know, names aside, I think just as far as like skin tones go and general look and appearance, I think I kept it pretty vanilla and not expressive enough, not as diverse as I should have, and that's a regret. And part of that was because I didn't know, you know, really how to handle different kinds of skin tones with splices at first, and so I never really accounted for it. I didn't know how feasible it was. I know Absolution, which is Zest Dynamite's project, has done a lot of really cool art, especially for darker skin tones, and it looks beautiful. And I kind of wish that, you know, given how big the cast and game are, that I invested more upfront in making a more diverse cast and accounting for different types of skin tones and ethnicities to make the game world a little bit more vibrant. So that's a bit of a regret. If I was to start from scratch, I'd probably consider that a bit more, because I think it would make a better and literally more colorful game. So a little bit of a, you know, sore spot there that I wish I had thought of more. And then kind of lastly with writing, I think I focused too much on Storch and co, and I realized that the game suffers for it. I think part 1 came out really good as a solid kind of condensed experience. I've heard a lot of people say that 1E is particularly hype and a good bookend to that arc, and then that part 2 feels a lot more like filler and the rest of the game doesn't really hold up as well, and that's totally fair. Part of that is the issue with the part structure. I wouldn't do part structure again. I think that lends itself to everything needing a specific neat arc, which I didn't really consider when I did the part structure. I kind of just did it to bookend certain aspects of the story, but maybe could have done a bit more to make the other parts feel a little bit more epic in their own right. So that's a bit of a regret in the part structure, but I do think I spent too much time with Storch. I should have spent more time with Titus. I think Titus is a much more compelling character. I think there's a lot more I could have done with him. I think I kept too much of the focus on Storch too late into the story and should have shifted a bit more. Titus probably could have gotten some more screen time, maybe a few others around him. My favorite scenes in the hack are Titus Helga scenes. I think those are generally the most quality of my writing. And I think by the end, Storch and co kind of outwear their welcome a bit. And while, you know, they're all characters I've made, so I'm quite fond of them, I do kind of wish that I shifted focus a bit sooner and kind of kept it more on the ensemble. You can tell in part 4 that I got a little bit better about this, because there are scenes where Storch isn't even present, which I think is pretty unusual for a Fire Emblem store to not feature its main lord. And so I think if I was to do it again, this type of structure story with multiple lords, I probably would have had more emphasis on Titus. I would have had more with Waluyo. I would have had more with some side characters. I spent too much time with Storch, and I think my sanity suffered for it, because while Storch was fine to write, he certainly wasn't my favorite. I had a lot more fun with other characters. Let's see. And then, lastly, this is probably the most controversial one, but in some ways I really wish that I learned and liked build files, because there's a lot of cool stuff I could have done with secret promotions and strength magic split and Thracia escape. A lot of newer mechanics that came out after I'd already started would have been a lot easier to implement had I gone into a build file, and so I do regret not learning it. But every time I tried to learn it, I didn't like it, and I think the finished product is fine enough as is, but definitely something I kind of wish that I wish I was more technical is really my problem. It's not something I'm very good at. It's not something I have a strong interest in getting better at, and I wish that I had that interest, because then I knew if I had the interest, I would learn it and I would get good at it, but I don't, and I don't really enjoy looking at a build file and doing the hack in the build file. Even if it is technically superior, it's unfortunately for me less fun, but I wish that I enjoyed it because I think the project would ultimately be better. But now shifting gears a bit to things that I'm actually glad that I did. There's a couple that stand out to me. One is I'm glad I didn't spend time doing eventing or conditionals. No one noticed for like years, I would say, in development that there were no moving cutscenes on the map where like the sprites move along the map. No one really started calling that out until more recently. No one noticed for a long time. And my view on that was that oftentimes these scenes get forgotten because there's not that much you can do. The sprites moving along the map is a lot of extra technical work in my mind for little gain. And so I found that I saved a lot of dev time not doing that, and I think it was a gamble that paid off because not that many people noticed. Some people call it out and they're like, oh, I wish you would have done this more, but for the most part, I don't think it would have enhanced the story very much anyway, for at least what I try to do. So limiting the amount of moving cutscenes, only doing it when absolutely necessary, which was for scripted battles, of which there are like 3 in the game. That's something that I'm pretty glad I did, and kept the eventing as simple as possible in order to progress forward. I think it's really easy to get stuck when you have to do so many different things for so many different variations on a single chapter, and it really can stall momentum, and most players aren't going to see all of it. So it's a bit of a waste in my mind. So kind of glad I didn't invest too much in eventing, even though people will say that, Dan, your eventing really stinks, which is fair. I'm not good at it. I don't enjoy it. But no moving cutscenes was, I think, a smart move, and something I'm glad I didn't invest much time in. Another thing I'm glad I did is that I waited to release the full hack until all the supports were written. I think it would have been a lot harder for the reception. I think the hack's reception wouldn't have been as positive if supports weren't there at first. I think when you release a finished product, I think that builds a lot of interest right up front. And if it's a little bit more feature bare without supports, especially if supports are in your hack, I think you'll have a hard time getting people to go back and play again with supports. I also think you'll get bogged down by feedback from that initial release that you won't have time to do supports. So I'm glad that after I finished the game and the game was ready to go, I spent 6 months just writing supports and inserting all the supports into the game. And then when I released it, I think there was a bit extra attention on the project because, oh wow, it's a finished hack with full supports written. That's pretty cool. And then I think that helped. It mitigated the amount of work I needed to do after. On the writing side, it was a lot more of just editing the but certainly providing a bit more diversity in what characters are interested in, as well as how they communicate with one another. I think that helped quite a lot, and part of that was having these kind of somewhat meaningless conversations about food and other topics that didn't really advance the plot. And I think this extra flavor, or you can think of it as like fat in the pan, I think that helps ultimately make a tastier and more flavorful script. So I'm glad that I kind of stuck to my guns there. I think it helps the game stick out and have its own identity Otherwise, I think it might seem a little too generic. So those are my thoughts on Vision Quest. I'm still working on some updates. I'll get to them eventually, but I did want to reflect on some of the things that I've been thinking about. And I want to thank everyone again for their support, the team that helped me. I'm very grateful for. They're all listed in the guide, in the credits, and on the thread, so you can look there to see who they are. And thank you all for your feedback over the past couple months. And I'm hoping to get a new version out at some point in the future. So until then, guys, thank you.